Have you heard about HTML div or sectioning? That is what we're going to look at in this video. Now, div or sectioning within HTML allows you to sectionalize different parts of your HTML page. Look at W3 Schools. Let me explain that. This section, this menu section, the whole of this section is actually a div on its own, a section on the page. Now, by the left sidebar of this page, it's another section on this page. The right part of the page is another section. Then on the main section, which is within the third one that is at the middle of the page, it's also another section of the page. So sectionalizing each of your items on a page is actually what is known as HTML sectioning, or in most cases they use div. Now this div allows you to define different sections of your page. If I right click on this page and I click on view page source, there are a lot of things going on here actually, a lot of things. But what I'm saying is that if we navigate up here, you can see that we have a div with different classes and ID. Then in that section, we have another div here defining an ID and a number of classes. Just like there is another div and a lot of div and a lot of div. We would be doing a lot of div when it comes to HTML pages. You cannot have a full HTML page without having to define sections. So sections are usually defined with div in HTML. Now let's take a look at how that really works in the coding section. Now within our body tag, we have H1, P and P and P tags. Let's define about 3 different sections on our page. Now I'll delete all of these and then I'm going to have a new div defined. Div means that this is a division of your page, a section of your page. So within the div, we can have a huge lot of content, but we know that it's actually a div. This is a section on its own. We can have another div, just like we have here, then we can have the third one, div. So I can define the styling for the first div by saying that I want the ID of this div. I want to be able to identify this div with this particular name first. So anytime I style the first ID, it's going to apply that styling on the first div. Then the second one, I can apply this to be the second, and then I can apply this ID to be the third. So this means that we are able to identify which div are we talking about. Now, going back to the style section here, we don't need all of these stylings. So let's style the first ID. How do we grab or get a particular ID? We get IDs by putting in the hashtag followed by the name of that ID, in this case the first ID. So what are the styling we want to apply for the first ID? Let's define a width and an height. The height of this block, that is this div, should be, for example, 200 pixels. So I want to define the width. We don't want it to just be as big as anyhow it wants. We want a 200 pixel width. So we have a square defined on the page. Then we can also specify a border for this particular div. So the border is going to take, for example, the size of the border is going to be 1 pixel. We want it to be solid, and after the solid we can define a color. Then the color of that border should be say a blue. Then we're done. And there are some other things we could do with that, but let's give it a background. Yes, let's give our div a background color. So the background color should be some sort of gray. Also, yes, some sort of gray, and then we can reload to see what is happening on our page. That is it. So with just this div, without even writing anything within it, we have given it an ID of first. So we have been able to style our div with all of these CSS tools. We have our height and width and border and the background color to be this. Interestingly, we can do that for the second ID, which is ID to be equal to second. So let's take an hash, then the second, then we define that. So let's take the same height and width of 200 and 300, and then we can define the background color for this one to be red. Then we can define the border to be just like, we can say just 4 pixels. Then there's another way to dashed, then we can have red. So I'm just trying to change these different parameters so that you can see what's going to give you. So you have that, and then we can also do that for the third one. But one interesting thing that comes with HTML classes is that you can just, instead of having to add height and width of the same size to each of these or all of these IDs, you can just specify a particular one. Say for example, box. So I'm going to have a class of box to define that particular height and width for us. So we have a height and width to be equal to this. Then we know that our border is going to be applied to everything. So we know that anytime we have a box, then they should have height, width, and border. Now our first ID is just having a background color. Then our second is having a different background color. So then we can apply this class to this div to be, the class name is now box. Then we can also apply that to the second one to be class to be equal to box. Then we can also apply it to the third one, class to be box. So if I reload the page, then this should be applied to all of the 3 boxes on the page.